Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writing Quest. My name is Brenden Pugh. Today we have Bethany Garcia with us. She is the author of Thieves and Shadows and a bunch of other things, and so she's going to tell us all about that. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Yes, I am Bethany. I write under BSH Garcia, and Thieves and Shadows was my debut novel, and I'm currently writing in that series, The Heart of Quinaria.
Nice. Well, so let's continue with that. Why don't you tell us how you got started with this, where this idea for this fantasy epic came from, and kind of take us on the journey.
So it started not in a place of setting out to write a book. I've always been really fascinated and obsessed with story. Growing up on the Oregon coast with three younger siblings, we were always orchestrating these kind of backyard epics where we were creating our own worlds and characters, and those characters were growing with us over the years of our lives. So I usually pinpoint my obsession with story going back to that childhood play acting. And in high school, and right after, I thought that passion was translating into acting. So I was pursuing that because I've always had a strong love of character. And at the time, I was really lured by, just film and theater and stuff. So one activity I would do to get into character would be to go on jogs or hikes and just kind of like embody that character by forgetting my body. It allowed me to kind of like shut me down and step into other characters. But as I was doing that one day, I kept getting the scene for what would be the ending chapter in Of Thieves and Shadows. It just kept like usurping my whole character study, and I could not get that closing scene out of my head. So I always say it kind of took me by force. It was not something that I intended to do. It just would not leave me alone. So I loved writing. I've always been a big writer and a reader, but I didn't think I didn't have like any passionate goals to become a professional writer outside of like my casual writing and my journaling and whatnot. And it was ironically not until after I got my English degree that I kind of had this gap in my schedule. I had been going to school full time and working full time. And I was like, oh, I've got this couple of hours set aside every day that I had been using for homework and my thesis and whatnot. And like, well, I have that story that's, been following me since I was, 20, and, why don't I finally do something with it? It won't leave me alone. And I had minored in creative writing, and that was how it came to be. I finally just sat down. I spent a couple of months just reading a lot about writing and writing like practice exercises, like little workshop style things. And then I finally sat down and worked on the world and characters, and then the story came from there.
Nice. It's awesome when I feel like that's how it happens for almost everyone. Of like you have no idea, you're not really even trying to come up with an idea, and then like you're just doing nothing in particular, and all of a sudden you have an idea,
Yes.
and then it like won't leave you alone. And like that was when I came up with my original idea of like I was working in a factory that made coffee pots, so like I was literally doing nothing, and then all of a sudden it was just like bloop, and so
Yes.
it's just so wild how that creativity happens. Do you have so since then do you have other ideas in this world, or just ideas, or like once you finish this, is there something else after that?
So I have a pretty solid idea of where I want to go with the main series. My second book's about to come out, and I have two novellas as well that are prequels. And I want to, at the very least, finish out this series with probably another 2 books is what I'm thinking will happen. We'll see what the story does. I also have 2 other novellas I want to write eventually within it. And then as far as the world, I think I'm going to have to just kind of reevaluate once I've done all of that, because I put a lot into the world building. There's so like thousands and thousands of years that I could really work with if I wanted to tell a story, like another series within the world. But I also don't want to I really struggle with when, other creators and shows and things, they just keep doing something for a buddy and you can tell the passion's gone or there's nothing left to be told in that world. So I don't want to be guilty of that. So I'm just kind of leaving the door open on it after I finish the main series. But I do have a lot of other projects kind of percolating in the back of my mind too that I'm going to be working on probably intermittently and then after the series is over.
Yeah, it's kind of like I feel like that's been Christopher Paolini. Like he came up with the first 4 books, and then he didn't really do anything in that world forever. And then
Yeah,
all of a sudden now he's like, oh, I think I have this story that I wanted to, like, that's so much better, I think, than
it's so true.
just like, we have this one idea and I'm just going to hammer it until
Mhm.
it has nothing left and so
Yeah.
I think that's very wise to do, for sure.
Thank you. I think it's good to kind of leave people wanting. Like for me, some of my favorite series ended on a note where I'm like, oh, I want more. I wish there was more, but also it's so good.
Hmm.
I don't want anything to come that's going to be subpar.
Yeah. Well, and even like as a creator, you don't want to get to a place where like you hate it either, where it's like
Exactly.
all of a sudden you're just having to create more in that world because you feel like you have to or something.
Hmm.
So I think if you can leave the reader wanting more, but also if for you as a creator, I think it's good for everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you have a English degree. Does Did you, so you were going to act, did you plan on doing that as well? Or did that come out of like, you wanted to write? Like, how did you get into that and how'd that play in with your writing?
My 20s were just out of control.
Been
I
there,
kept,
been there.
yeah. So I ended up coming back. I had been out in LA for a bit, and I had at work. I was studying at a conservatory there. I'd done some like commercials and smaller roles in theater and stuff, but I had some personal issues that required me to come back to Colorado at that time. And I decided, I hadn't wanted to go to college right out of high school, not knowing what I wanted to do. And so when I came back, I'm like, well, I've always loved English. It's been a huge passion of mine. And I like to do something with writing or potentially teaching down the road. So it seemed like just kind of a shoe in as far as education went. At the time, I was working in leasing, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go with it. Just that I thought that'd be good to have in the bag. So I fell in love with writing again during school, though.
Hmm.
I had always done a lot of like creative projects on the side when I was younger, but going to college allowed me to take a lot of creative writing classes, which I think kind of reawoke that part of me that I hadn't explored in a while. And I realized I could marry my love of like story and character along with writing. And it was kind of one of those light bulb moments. Like, why didn't I think of this sooner? It
Yeah.
makes so much sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think, writing for me, like I kind of came to it because I I love being creative. I love to tell stories, but I had been a musician for a long time, and then it kind of got to a point where like I was married, we had a daughter, and I was like, I need something that I can kind of still be creative, but it doesn't rely on too many other people. Whereas like
Exactly.
music and stuff, a lot of times can be like you got to be in a band or you got to go play at bars and clubs, and like it just takes so much more effort. Where it was like even acting, it's like you got to have a cast or a play or a show or like something to do. Where writing was like I could funnel that creative energy without having to bug too many people, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a lot more flexible for
Hmm.
sure. You can tuck it in here and there instead of spending an hour to, drive to perform at a concert or to do your rehearsal or your audition or
Yeah. So what kind of influences do you
yeah.
have that have, I'm assuming, based because it's the fantasy I was reading on your website, Tolkien's probably a big one. But what kind of influences do you have with your story?
So, at the risk of sounding very unoriginal, my first franchise obsession that I can remember way back in the day was the original Star Wars trilogy. I watched it pretty young, and I was so like enamored with just the Jedi and just the scope of the world building, and it was fantasy and space. So I thought it was really cool. Princess Leia was like my idol for so long,
Hmm.
and I think that was my first experience getting lost in a world and wanting to recreate that for myself again and again and for others. So
Hmm.
from there, it kind of, ballooned out into a lot of other interests. Reading Lord of the Rings was definitely a huge one, but it was actually a bit later in life. I'd say when I was younger, it was a lot more actually probably in the sci-fi space, ironically. And then very adventure-y. There were certain video games that I would play, and I've always been into like more of the story than anything else. But yeah, reading Tolkien's a huge one. I really love a lot of classic literature, and so it's kind of interesting because I feel like the more wide read that I've become, the more wide read you are, it allows you to really bring unique things to the genre, like of your choosing. So
Mm-hmm.
I've always tried to read as broadly as possible and consume content as broadly as possible, because I think there's something to be learned for so many different types of storytelling mediums and genres.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, video games also influence a lot of my writing. I'm a huge fan of Skyrim,
Mm-hmm.
and I love Horizon Zero Dawn and some of those more expansive ones that have all of these lore kind of, interwoven. And I think that's a huge part, is just, I love a good story with a good world. Like, I want to feel like this is a place that exists fully in my head, because I think that's what creates that immersion for me.
Yeah. Is world building kind of like a character to you? Because that's kind of, you hear a lot about, if you look at like a lot of traditional writing advice type things, you hear, people will say like, well, don't info dump too much and don't,
Mhm.
focus so much on the world building up front because you want people. And some of that is obviously true and a good advice, but at the same time, like for me, like I love world building, so I'm never like having a problem with a big info dump or something because I just like
Yeah.
it. So is world building to you kind of a character in the story? Like, does it play that kind of a role?
I think world building is kind of blanketing everything. So the way I look at it is, everything comes from the characters in the world building, but the characters are influenced by their world. Like, without their world, they're not the same characters that I'm writing in the story or that we're reading. Luke isn't who Luke would be in A New Hope if he hadn't been this, desolate farmer's boy on this abandoned kind of crappy desert planet. And so much of that, I guess, in that sense, the world is a character, but it's also the story. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, I can't go into any writing project without knowing a lot about my world. And I guess in that sense, I'm a strong plotter, in the sense that I need to know the place that I'm in. And I think, again, it comes back to that immersion, but it also comes back to your characters, because all of their decisions and their goals and their dreams, it's completely shaped by the world they live in, just like we're shaped by our circumstances and our world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the key is to know everything you possibly can about it, but to sprinkle it in naturally into the story. And I think it actually does happen when you know a lot about your world. And I think when people kind of confuse info dumping with, when I think it depends like how much is done at once. And sometimes you do need to know a lot to kind of set the stage. But what I try to do is just gradually reference it throughout like the story. So it's not so much at once, but it's just, you'll catch something here and there as your character's noticing and navigating through their world, and drop a bit here. But I love all the juicy world building details, for sure. I think it's what makes it feel lived in.
Mm-hmm. We're very similar in that I find that like generally when I get stopped up, like if I'm writing and I'm just like I don't know how to keep going, it's never really, most of the time, I'd say, 90% of the time, it's never like a story plot point. It's generally because I'm like, I don't know how the magic system works right now, or I don't know how this like thing, it's like a world building thing that's like, I know what I want the story to do, but like the game mechanics don't make sense. So I don't know how to
Yes.
get it there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's so relatable, because yeah, that a lot of time that stops me too. I'll get to a point and it's a question of, okay, maybe I've never done this work on my character. So what is true about this part in her world? Or, oh, I never thought about this particular event for this particular culture at this particular time in history and how it's going to influence everything. So no matter how prepared I am, there's always a lot of uncovering that's done as you're writing, because those questions pop up that you didn't think to ask yourself, a couple of paragraphs back.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't know until you try to write it. And then it's like, I don't know how this works, So how, when it comes to world building or even character, I guess really anything writing related, what would you say are some of your strengths as a writer, and then maybe some of your weaknesses? Like, what are your, like, I really do this really well, or like, these are the things I struggle with.
According to my reviews, everyone loves the world building. So I
Perfect.
guess that's probably one of my strengths, because it is so important to me. It's probably the thing I'm the most hyper fixated on. So that's a huge one. I think I'm good at, I guess, taking a character and making sure that they have some growth and a journey. That's another important thing to me in storytelling. And there are certain stories where it works like an episodic style storytelling, like Sherlock Holmes doesn't need to go through crazy character arcs because that's not what his story's about. It's about the mystery, where I think, at least in the stories that I'm writing that are, despite having big plots that are they're more character driven. So I spend a lot of time just asking myself, does this ring true? So whether that's situational, the world, or the characters, I really strive for realism, which sounds ironic, writing epic fantasy and it's set in a secondary world. But I think that realism needs to be there. I also really enjoy dialogue. And I think that probably comes a bit from the acting background. Is I feel like dialogue is really important to me. It flows so much easier for me than a lot of the other parts of my writing. I could just picture the characters clearly and picture their exchanges. Sometimes I get up and I kind of like walk around and act it out before I actually sit and type the dialogue. One thing that I struggle with that took me a long time with my first book, at least. I went through 12 drafts of Thieves and Shadows over about 5 years. And one thing that I really had to work at was taking what I saw so clearly in my head and making sure that that was clear to the readers. Because I think when you get super close to your work and you've been living with your characters and you've been living with your story, that, it's second nature to you. So I don't feel like, I know what this looks like in my head. This is enough of a description. And then that's where beta readers or a critique partner comes in and saves the day, kind of reminding me like, oh, hey, I don't get what you're saying here. Or could you remind me like what this is? Because I tend to just assume the intelligence of all of my readers. I'm like, people figure this out as they go. But sometimes I'm a little too, I guess, not on the nose enough with certain things. So that's something that I'll try to catch in drafts, is to provide clarity a little more and like reference back to things, which is probably the hardest part of writing is, just getting out of your head and reminding yourself that you're doing this for other people and to look at it from their perspective. Since you don't have that live feedback at the time like you would with music or acting, it's kind of like that delayed buffering and then you get it back. So I can't stress the importance of early readers enough for that reason.
Yeah. It's the feedback loop for writing is really slow. Like it's, a lot of some things you can do the creative thing and then you get feedback right away really fast. Like writing is like, it takes you a long time to actually write it. And then by the time you give it to someone, even beta readers who are like supposed to, get on it and read it, you still gotta wait and they gotta, so it's hard sometimes to get out of that, like, because it's not like you write something and then you immediately get feedback on whether or not something is working or not. And so I've my brother writes, and so we bounce a lot of things off each other. And I remember early on giving him some stuff and he was just like, I don't really know what anything looks like. Like I kind of think I do, but I don't really know. Like I can't picture it in my head. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I could see it. But then I was like, okay, I'm not actually telling you exactly what I think it looks like,
And that it's so hard because it's like so much of it is subjective too. Like, you're going in and some people are like absolutely loving it, because it's more fast paced or because, there's no filler. And then you get the people commenting, I want all that. I want all those slow moments. I want the excessive details. I want the 1-page Martin style Westeros feast so I could picture all the food. And I think that's been one of the hardest things for me to balance, is just knowing when to take feedback and to change it, and also knowing when it's just subjective and, trying to find that balance of writing to your readership, but also staying true to what you want to write and the story you want to tell. I don't know if I'll ever figure it out.
Yeah, I think it's probably always just a balance and you just kind of keep figuring it out as you go. So you mentioned you mentioned Sherlock Holmes, made me think about, do you think a lot about character arcs before you write? Like, do you think, oh, this person needs to be more of a positive arc, this one needs to maybe be a flat arc? Like, do you think through that, or do you kind of let the characters eventually inform you as you go?
My characters are kind of like angry toddlers. So I have an idea laid out for them, and I think it's a great plan. And I type up nice spreadsheets and I go over the notes with them, and then we start writing and they do the opposite.
Sure.
So it's kind of, I found that some of them have stayed pretty true to how I initially envisioned them. And then other ones, like I've got a couple of POV characters where they've just done a complete 180. Like one of my characters, Jackie, in my first book, she is not even the same character she was in the first draft of, the first book. And it's been so interesting to, just have that experience of me kind of laying things out and then them changing. But now I'm to a place where I've come to expect it with my writing, and it actually feels like I'm on the right track. So I'll sit there and I do a really thorough outline process that's almost like a zero draft. So by the time we get around to actually drafting it, it's more like a second draft. And at that point, it usually starts deviating quite a bit, but it feels right. And I feel like I can handle it better because I had an initial roadmap, kind of like one of those things where, if you know the rules, you can break them. And for me, if I know where I thought the story and the characters were going, I feel more comfortable when it's time to deviate. And then I really trust that that is where the story wants to go because it's happening organically.
Yeah. Do you mind if we do a little deep dive on that? So like,
Sure.
how do you go about those detailed outlines? Like, where do you start, and then how do you actually go about doing that?
So I started by researching just a lot of what, the like writing books would suggest. I found I think it's Jerry Jenkins had like the snowflake outline approach. And then I read Save the Cat. The Gotham Writers Workshop had another one. And I just read like a lot of different people's approaches, like Stephen King's on writing. I have so many craft books and they all tell you different things. So it was kind of a crapshoot at first to figure out my outline process. And what I finally settled on was kind of a hybrid. So I think the world building for me is an entirely separate thing where I just sit there and try to ask myself as many questions as I can about the world. Then when I was at least drafting or preparing for Quinaria, that process took me at least a month, just hours a day, just trying to live in the world and understand its history. And then the actual outline, I started with more of a bullet point method, but now I do a really, really, really loose Save the Cat skeleton just for like a reference point. But it usually ends up not following it perfectly. It's more of like a diving board for me. And from there, I'd say my biggest outline right now, or my biggest technique is for every scene, to have a purpose for the character, that's the POV, and a purpose for the story. So I try to make it where every scene in my writing is furthering the plot and furthering the character development, and that there is a clear goal for both the story and the character within that scene. And if not, I don't write it, because so often that just comes back to, like, when I'm stuck with a scene, I just revert back to that. What does the character want in this moment? And how is that driving their journey forward and the story forward? And I usually kind of free write before starting a scene, because if I go into it completely blind, I just freeze up and I get stuck and I'll stop writing. But if I have like a paragraph of like, this is what I think might happen and this is what I think the character might do, even if I end up changing it as I write the scene, it gives me that confidence to dive into it.
Yeah, it's awesome. I always like what Abby Emmons, I don't know if you've ever seen her YouTube channel. She always talks about, like, for each chapter she tries to do like 5 parts. There's just the setup, the tension, a crossroads moment, their decision, and then the, like, what's the new thing, like that. And so I've kind of adopted that loosely, because I feel like you said about, like, what's the character's point, what's the story point. It just makes sure that everything actually has some sort of momentum. Now, some scenes may be more than others, but at least has a purpose.
Exactly. Yeah, there should always be something. I feel like there should always be something gained. And it doesn't have to be like huge, not every scene needs to be a crazy battle or an emotional blow up, but just having something that's changing within the character or within the story, or ideally both, because I think that's my biggest fear is I don't like getting bored in stories and in movies. So I really try to make sure that everything has relevance and, that it's furthering something along. Chris Nolan is kind of my idol as a director when it comes to that, because his stories are so, they're cut of everything that doesn't matter. And I love that, because I think it just makes everything richer. And I think you can have like any kind of fluff or extra boosting in the scene and still have that point, kind of underlying it all. But when that's lost, it just, I think the scene falls flat. So the only time I really go in and just kind of randomly free write is when I'm just trying to get into a character voice or something. But those scenes almost never go into my book, because they're just literally crazy meanderings of a character in an irrelevant situation.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than like watching a TV show and I feel like this happens a lot with TV shows right now where like you watch an episode and you got to the end and you're like, why did I even watch? Like
What
nothing
happened?
happened. Like you go back like when you end it, you think like, oh, something is wrong. And then you think about it, you're like, well, nothing happened. And like we're
Yeah,
still in the same spot.
I just watched an hour of TV, and yeah, this did absolutely. I love them. We always call them, my dad and I call them the throwaway episodes. Like, why do we even have this?
Yeah.
It does nothing.
Yeah, for sure. Um, let's talk a little bit about since we're kind of in this productivity zone.
Yeah.
How do you go about kind of your writing practice, and then maybe even so you have a family and young kids. How does that kind of play a role or how did that change writing?
Yes.
After you had kids.
So it's definitely been a huge learning curve. Before I had kids, because I did start this series before kids, it was just one of those things where I would spend at least an hour after work every day. And then on weekends, I'd spend the better part of a morning just creating, and my husband is really creative too. He's into the more like art side. So he loves drawing and crafting. And so we'd always just kind of have this space. We're like, okay, it's our creating time. I'm going to go over here and do my creating. You're going to go do your creating. And I ended up banging out the first 125K draft of my book in 2 months, which to this day is my insane record. It's never going to happen again.
Yeah.
But that was really good for a while. And then when I had my first kid, my son, there was a period where I didn't write at all. And to be fair, at that time too, he was born in December of 19. So we all know what happened over the next few months. And I don't think I touched my story for almost a year. It was just, there was way too much going on. And I would not have been able to manage my baby and my mental health by doing any writing that first year. But I got the itch for it and I really missed my story and I missed my writing. So for the next couple of years, my main approach was to just write during nap times, and I went from having like my ideal ritual, like my space with my desk and my candles and my music to, okay, the baby's asleep, going to grab the laptop and just try to get like a paragraph in. And that was a huge rewiring for me because I very much liked my order and my routine. And I usually take like 15 to 20 minutes to even get into a flow, when now sometimes that's all I have. So it's forced me to be kind of on my feet about it and learn to really make time for the art. But I think the ironic thing about that was it wasn't until I had kids that I actually took my publishing journey seriously. Because before then I was just writing and it was kind of like, this is fun. I don't know if I'm ever going to show this to anyone. I just really love this world of these characters. And then, I had a couple people read it and they're like, this is really cool. I think people would like this. Have you looked at publishing options? And so after having, a kid and stepping away from my then full-time job, it kind of helped me refocus on what I did want to do with my life. And I'm like, I do want to make this happen. I do want to get my stories out there one way or another. So it gave me that drive to pursue publishing.
Yeah. What pushed you towards self-publishing?
So I was aware of self-publishing from the get-go, but I did not want to look into it because I was really overwhelmed by it. I didn't like just the thought of trying to juggle my life, my writing, and the publishing side of things scared me. So I set up everything for a trad approach. And I think I started querying in October of 2022. Sounds about right. Yeah. And no, it would have been October of 21. So I started querying. I had gone through multiple drafts, had feedback at that point, and targeting, different publishers and agents and whatnot. And boy, did that first rejection letter sting.
Yeah.
You try to prepare yourself for it, but
it's like someone just smacks you in the face. They just like,
yeah. It's like every positive thing I've been told about my writing to date just did not matter anymore.
Yeah.
Like I'm one of those people who like, here's the one negative thing and it's going to overshadow anything that was good ever.
Yeah.
But I kept it up because I wanted to know that I had at least hit that approach really hard. So I kept querying, revising my letter. And I kept getting kind of similar feedback because I got a couple of full requests from agents. And I was really grateful. One actually took the time to, have kind of an ongoing email thread with me and basically said, your writing's great. This is a really cool concept. but you're breaking too many rules for a debut. Like, we can't have this many POVs. You're exceeding the word count by 20K, even though I had cut it down from 150K to like 127.
Mm-hmm.
And then they want really clean standalone books in case the publishing house decides to not continue with the series. There's so many rules. And I knew going into this series that I was not writing something that was super to market in the trad world, but I couldn't convince myself to write something that was more marketable. So after I had that exchange with that particular agent, I really looked hard into self-publishing, and I thought, maybe this is the better option for this particular story. And because I didn't want to set it aside and write something else, because I was worried I would never come back to it. It would just be this dead in the drawer project that never got touched again. And after I looked at self-publishing, I actually got an offer from a small press. And then I was kind of hit with, what do I do? Do I go with this, this indie trad press, or do I do it myself? And after reading through the contract and thankfully all of the research I had done in self-publishing, for me at least, it didn't seem like it was a good enough deal to give up my rights and my higher commission for a smaller house, because I felt like they couldn't give me what a big five could. And so I'd be giving up everything for not that much in return. So I was kind of it's all or nothing. I'm either going to go the big five or I'm going to go this. So I declined that offer and set out for self-publishing. And I do think it was the best choice for this series. For future projects, I'll kind of play it by ear, as to whether or not I want to try Quinaria again or just continue down this path. But it definitely has gone a lot better than I thought it would. It's overwhelming when you step into it, but it's like anything else. It's just a learning curve, and, you just take it a day at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate. Like, I understand why, publishing houses have their rules, and they got to sell the books. I understand, but it's also unfortunate because what I think it's done is it's lended itself to, there's less creativity and there's less, things getting out that are different, which I think is what's pushing people towards the self-publishing. But
Yes.
what's funny about it, I think, is that it's not really a new problem. Like, going back to Star Wars, the reason that he did it the way he did it is because he didn't want anyone else to have control over his story, and he didn't like the deals that they gave him, and that was 45 years ago. So it's just interesting that there's always going to be that tug of war between the creator and the people that are putting it out. So here's a question for you. Do you think that will ever change, in the sense that we live in a world now where anyone can build an audience? Like, you don't have to have... It used to be like when you were a band, in a music group or whatever, if you didn't have a label, you weren't going anywhere. Right. You just couldn't do it. Same with the book. So now that we kind of live post that world, I guess I don't really know what my question is, but you see where I'm going with it?
Yeah. If I hope, and correct me if I'm completely off track here, but I think, so in one way, I really level the visibility we have thanks to the internet and how it's created such a huge space for independent creators. I think that what is hard as an indie author is there is this stigma associated with indie publishing that you don't see with other arts so much. Like, it really fascinates me because, sorry, it seems like a lot of indie painters and artists and musicians, it's all the rage. It's actually really cool, to these kind of off the beaten path, creatives and the work that they produce, and people actually pride themselves in seeking out indie musician. Or we've got all these indie film festivals where top Hollywood people are trying to shed that label to get into the more indie space. And I just hope that we can see a change in that for authors, because there really does seem to be just kind of this cloud. Or, I've had people tell me in private chats and whatnot, I'm surprised your book was this good, because everybody who's indie, I thought they were just basically copied and pasting rough drafts onto Amazon or whatever. And, just kind of, or, most of it's crap. But to be fair, there's crap in every single creative space. If you want to play like that, it's just, there's just a major disconnect from people wanting the confirmation of the gatekeepers, at least in writing, that this has been vetted and this is okay. But I think we are starting to see that turn, especially with some bigger authors who are intentionally, making their work more in the indie space, like Brenden Sanderson and whatnot. I think it's helping at least kind of lessen that stigma, seeing some of the bigger names start to change and have like their Kickstarter projects and whatnot. So I'm grateful for that. I think we will see a turn. I also think the trad houses are getting a little fearful of like the indie rise on Amazon and whatnot. And, Orbit not that long ago opened up their, what is it called? They have like a new press that isn't like that they just like will do digital acquisitions almost. So they're putting out like audiobooks and ebooks, but not print. And I think it's kind of their way to stretch like the umbrella a bit more and get their hands on more creative talent without doing the risk of printing, because that's their biggest thing is they're a business at the end of the day and they want their money and they don't want to sink their money into printing out all of these copies for a book that might flop. So I feel like they're kind of being a little sneaky by doing these digital only acquisitions because they're not having to front as much risk, but they're still fishing, or they're going out and they're poaching like the really successful indie authors. And so it's just, I think it's a really ever changing horizon right now. And I don't know, it could potentially get to the point where a lot of agents are just kind of handpicking the better to do indie authors because the work's been done. They vetted themselves. They have a fan base. This is a win for everyone, and I don't know. It's hard to know which route to go just with it all, because I think one of the things that a lot of indie authors struggle with is visibility. That's probably my biggest issue, especially when you can't afford ads and the algorithms are just turning into a nightmare. You're not even getting half of your followers and stuff. So it's overwhelming at times. I think I'd like to have my feet in both worlds eventually, but who knows?
Yeah, I agree. I think I do think the stigma is definitely fading. It's definitely better than it probably used to be, but it does also feel like things are like for some reason writing is more highly scrutinized than other art forms. And I'm not sure, I guess, why that is. I don't know why that would be, but yeah, I think I don't know. My wife and we do multiple small businesses and stuff, so I guess I've always in my head of like there's no other option other than self-publishing. Like I just wouldn't. I'm just built that way, I guess, where I'd be like, I don't want to sell it to anyone because it's mine, and
No, I get that.
But yeah, it's interesting how it's like it's like a different level. I don't know why it is that way, but maybe it's because it's takes so much longer to do or something. Like anyone can, put a song together and it sounds pretty good, and then like so. Yeah, it's interesting for sure. So let's go this direction. If you I want to formulate this. if you could take what you have, is there anything that you've done before, like so from the book you published before, you're still writing this series?
Yeah.
I've heard the quote before that all art is never finished, it's just abandoned. So do you already feel like there's some things that you kind of wish you maybe would have done a little differently as you go into the next parts of your series? Or is it still kind of too early to tell with some of that?
Absolutely. I want to change everything every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
That was the hardest part for me about finally publishing and letting go. My first book was, it never felt done and it never felt good enough. And sorry. I think a really big thing too is like the longer you work on a project, you're changing so much as a creator, but also just as a person. And so the way you were approaching something or a character or a situation or even a writing style changes drastically. Like I have a good account for most authors that they have a hard time going back and reading their first works, even if it wasn't objectively bad, even if it was good. You go through so much growth that you look back and you could see things that you could change. And so for my first book, I first started drafting that in 2018. It's 2024. And there are things that I'm sure if I wrote it and published it today, it would not be the same book. And I've kind of ironically noticed this trend of authors lately who have been going back and redoing their first books and like doing a new edition for it. You know, like they're cutting out chapters and rewriting and all these things. And I completely get where they're coming from. I get that that desire to go back and make it better in light of what you now know and kind of groom it in that sense. But for me, I feel like there's no benefit in looking back. I'm not on that project anymore. And my time is better spent perfecting my current writing and my new stories and my current world. And I think it's a very dangerous loop that you can be in to just be constantly fixing. So one thing that really helped me out with the first book on letting it go is I got to a point where a couple of, you know, writing friends were like, are you making the story better or are you just making it different? You know, and I got to a point where like, oh, I am just making it different. I'm like rewriting the sentence 5 times and no version was right or wrong. No word choice was right or wrong. It just kept changing, or I'm going to tweak this because this could be a little tighter and a little cleaner. But and as someone who struggles with perfectionism, it's been a hard thing for me. But I think I've gotten to a place where I can finally go, you know, this is as good as it can be at this time in my life. And I can't ask for any more than that. And I actually think, at least for me, that there's a danger of staying in a project for too long because then I start losing sight of it. You start seeing like this Jekyll and Hyde version of me and like what this earlier version of me thought versus this version. And then the story will start like contradicting itself. So I think I've got to a place where it's better for me to try to draft and revise as quickly as possible. And for me, that's still pretty slow. I'm not like the fastest, but I've kind of set a limit for myself with how much I'm going to attack something because it will get to the point where it's just muddled because I've just picked at it. So I think it's healthy to find a place where you walk away and you're like, you know, you acknowledge that it's not going to be perfect. It never is, but is it the best at this time? And I think that's, you know, all you can ask for.
Yeah. And that's why you hear this may be one of the pieces of writing advice where I think it's maybe the most valid of like, do not edit while you are drafting. Because it is so hard. And I remember early on getting very like, I kept going back and editing and like doing like, as I would get ahead, I'd change something and be like, oh, I should fix that back there. And then I just realized I was in this whole loop that I was never getting out of. And I kept going back and changing. And it's like, okay, keep going forward, even if there's things, you know, you need to change. But like, yeah, you get in that loop and it's no good.
Yeah. It's like, what's that saying? You know, done is better than perfect. Because yeah, I my initial prologue for my first book, I think I rewrote that probably 24 times. It got to the point where I was in this loop. I'm like, oh, I have this character epiphany. I need to go back and fix it all now. And I make the mistake of sometimes for a while, I would reread what I'd written the previous day when I was drafting. And I realized it took me like a year and a half to realize that that was just sabotaging me because it was turning me into this editor mindset, critiquing my words from the get-go. And then I would come back into drafting. I'm like, I'm paralyzed. I don't know, you know, this isn't perfect. If it's not coming out perfect the first time, maybe I just need to go back and keep tweaking other things and it will come to me. And it's a very dangerous place. And I struggle with it to this day. It's getting a little easier to manage, but turning off that editor hat is huge.
How do you filter through? So you send your book to beta readers, you send it to an editor, you know, whoever, all these people that have opinions about your work. How do you filter through the things that are like, this is a real thing that needs to be fixed, like this thing about a character needs to change, or the things that are more just like an opinion? So like, it's not really what you did isn't needing fixed, but it's like, how do you filter through those kinds of things?
It's difficult. Early on, I had a pretty large team. And I think as you're starting, it's important to just try to have as many people get eyes on it as possible so you can find your people, because you want readers who they're not afraid to, you know, suggest and correct you and critique you, but you also want them to have a vision that's in line with yours. So I've definitely had beta readers where I could just tell like this person is probably not my ideal reader, or they probably don't get my vision, and that's okay. But then you want to be careful to not, you know, take everything they say at face value. So I've gotten my team to a point where I have basically my critique partner who either reads it live with me, like as I'm drafting, we'll do like a kind of a Google Doc share on our projects, or she'll just alpha read. But I basically have 3 stages of like critical reading before it goes to editing. So critique partner, and then alpha readers, and then beta readers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a handful of people now. And I like how it's kind of like I've gotten this group that I can really trust their advice, to the point now where like where one of them says something, I'm like, oh, you're so right.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. But earlier on, before I had like that solid team, I would first ask myself, like, you're gonna like bristle at it, or at least I did, to any kind of constructive feedback. Like I initially go, you don't get my vision, your opinion sucks,
right.
and you don't even want to like think about it. So I would like read through it in doses and then just step away,
mm-hmm.
and then come back to it like usually at least a few minutes to a few hours later, just so I can clear my head. And then a lot of them are like just gut feelings. I'm like, okay, this is right. Like I deep down, even though I don't want to change this, I do agree with it and I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's something that I don't agree with and I don't see, or I feel like it's coming away from my vision, but it possibly could still be good advice, I kind of set that in a maybe pile and I wait till I get another person's feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And if enough people are pointing at the same thing, then I'm like, okay, this probably is an issue, even if I don't see it. And then there's some where I'm just like, you just know that this is just somebody's opinion and this does not at all jive with what I'm trying to do. So that goes in the trash. So kind of just those stages, but having that, the maybes and being able to weigh them against other people's feedback has been huge for me. Cause I had, just even on my most recent project, I had, one person who kind of wanted me to change something because they felt like it was kind of taking away from the pacing or whatever. But then I had my other 2 beta readers be like, this is so cool. I love having this thing in here and I want more of it. And so if I have more people saying, yes, do this, and it feels right with me, then I just continue with it.
Yeah. But. We kind of touched on this a little bit throughout, but how do you, again, this kind of goes hand in hand with that. So you get the book out and now you get reviews and criticism, and what is that process like? I'm sure there's parts that are just like, this is so terrible, but then there's other parts that are really great.
It's so painful. I thought that having spent a few years of my life acting and like dealing with rejection, like literally, like there were times where I walked into like an audition and they would just like put the script, like they just look out their phones before I even started because I already didn't meet their vision of the character. So like I've dealt with so much rejection that I thought acting would be or writing would be such a cinch, especially after going through like the querying trenches. I'm like, I can take any feedback, but the very first negative review I got just stuck with me.
Yeah.
And I think the hardest thing is not obsessively seeking them out. I went through a period when I first published where like I was on Goodreads multiple times a day and just like looking to see like, did anybody new or review me? What are they saying? And it was really unhealthy because even when you see a good one, like at least for me, again, I fixate on the bad, and I could get like so many positive ones in a row and get this one that wasn't even that mean and maybe just critiqued this part or this didn't work for them. And I'm like, I'm horrible. I'm ruined. I shouldn't be writing. I'm an imposter. And so it's one of those things where I just try to not go on very often and look at them. And then when I do, I try to make sure that I am in a good headspace. And I try to look at them as if I was looking at somebody's reviews of somebody else's book. And that really helps me to make it not so personal, because most of the time it really isn't. I have one review that I think is a little personal, but for the most part, I think it's just people, this doesn't work for me, or, this or this. And it's just not letting, in order for me to not let the bad reviews hit so hard, I also don't let the good reviews hit so hard. So I'm kind of more in a place where like, this is just all feedback and it is what it is. And I'm just going to take what I can from it and keep doing my thing. Because if focusing on any positive or negative feedback too much for me just kind of sets me in a spiral. And then my one cure for when I really am struggling with bad reviews is I go to my favorite authors who I idolize and I read their bad reviews. And I'm like, if people think they're bad, then there's hope for me.
Yeah. It's the, I've gotten a thicker skin after doing YouTube because you get all sorts of like, I think most people, have good intentions, even if they leave you a negative review. I think most people generally are like, it's probably decent feedback. But there's always those people that sometimes will just say something like, why'd you even say that? Like, that was just not even nice. I get comments like, I got one not too long ago that was like, you move your hands too much. And I was like, what? Like, what do you, what? Sorry, like, so it's that. So yeah, it's, you just gotta, the internet's a wild place. You just gotta take what you can and get rid of the rest, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. So coming up here close to an hour. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, I always like to end with this. What are some maybe like 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you would give to someone either who's kind of a new writer, new author, someone who's maybe starting their self-publishing thing, so they've written a book and they're going to start publishing? What are some of the things that you would tell them?
So for somebody who is just starting to actually draft, I would come back to that whole done is better than perfect thing. From what I hear, just especially spending time like in different writing spaces, I'm really involved in like the Instagram writing community. That was actually part of what pushed me to publish in the first place. And so many people never ever finish a single manuscript. And they get Shani syndrome, Shani idea syndrome, and they're jumping from project to project. And I think some people can write that way and have multiple things going at once. I cannot. My brain cannot be committed to more than one at once. But I think even if you're working on a couple, just have something that you finish, even if it's like a short story. The first few things I wrote were actually just like short fiction. And you want to have a project that you've seen through to completion, because not only does it give you like experience on the writing process from start to finish, but it gives you a whole thing to look back at and be proud of. And I really think the first draft is like the hardest thing for people. It's just finally finishing that first draft. And then second, I would say getting eyes on it, which is the second hardest part in my opinion. I think I didn't get beta readers for like 2.5 years on my story, or early readers, because I was so petrified of people reading my work. And I really struggle with imposter syndrome in all creative pursuits. But as tough as it was and as scary as it was to put myself out there, and I remember like getting ready to post for my first beta reader call on Instagram, and I had to have like 2 glasses of wine just to do it. Cause I'm like, I don't want to do this. I don't want people to see it, but I do, because that's why I write. So having people get feedback on your writing, because it's not only going to help you, but it's also going to, again, give you that confidence, because a good reader or a good critique partner or beta reader, they're going to point out the good with the bad too. And they're going to encourage you like, this is what you do really well. And I think you need to hear that and get outside of, like, writing can be so isolating and solitary if you let it be. And I think that's where a lot of those thoughts get a chance to invade and whatnot. So just say finish the draft, get some eyes on it. And then for publishing, I would say to take time and make sure that you research all like approaches to publishing, because a lot of people I think do go in having one thing in mind, but I think it really varies from person to person and even from project to project. You might have something that is really trad viable. Maybe you should pursue that. Or maybe you do like the indie press approach because you want to support another small press and they can give you that financial support while still giving you a bit more creative control. Or if you do want the complete creative control that comes with self-publishing, I think it's great. And I also think you can't possibly research enough, at least to start. There's a lot of great podcasts out there, and more often than not, I'd say just message a writer who you think seems to be doing well, especially if they seem like they're kind of approachable. I talk to a lot of people getting in, and then ever since I've been in, even, and having those dialogues, open up with other writers and being able to talk to them about things and bounce ideas off. It's been so huge. Like, I don't think I would have a book out today if I didn't have a community behind me that I could tap into and, give back to and then receive from.
Yeah. I since I started reaching out to people about doing the podcast and stuff, and I've been meeting all these people, like I've been saying this a lot on the show of like people everyone that I've met, I've not met one person who is not super like supportive, willing to help. Like everyone is it's like everyone's playing the same game and everyone's trying to do this together. So it's, everyone's been super great for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great community.
Well, this has been awesome, super fun, and I'm glad we could make it work, even through our technical difficulties in the beginning. So before we conclude here, why don't you tell us where we can find you? And you have a book, as of this recording, you have a book coming out pretty soon. So it'll probably be out by the time this airs, but why don't you tell us where we can find you?
Sure. So my website is probably the best diving board. It's just www.bshgarcia.com. I've got all of my social media links in there, all of my book links, my map, my pronunciation guides, all that. I also have my newsletter on there. So if you're curious to kind of check out my writing, my prequel novelette From the Ashes is free to my newsletter subscribers. But yeah, the website's just great for finding me. As far as social media, I'm pretty active on Instagram and Twitter, X, whatever. I'm usually on those. I'm at least once a week. So those are probably the best places to find me.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been great. This has been Bethany Garcia with us, and it's been awesome having her. So we'll put all that stuff down in the description below. And thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.